Okay, recording is on. I'll just briefly, as always, share my screen for a moment. Okay, so welcome to our weekly call. Brief reminder, this is not completely up to date now, but agenda for the call. We're going to discuss first, so we carried over from last week, AI privacy and confidentiality, because the first part of that discussion went so well we didn't have enough time. I think we had maybe 5 minutes to try and cover that topic, which would have been both ambitious and a bit pointless. So I think Mark kindly suggested we carry it over. We were also this week going to talk about the trust checker, but sadly Lucian, who's going to join us also from the DNS Research Federation, there was a bereavement in the family, so he can't join us this week. So I'm sure we'll pass on our condolences to Lucian. But we will nevertheless cover AI privacy and confidentiality, both with Mark Robertshaw, who was here with us last week, so welcome back, and also Dorottya. I'm looking at your surname, Dorottya, and I probably should have asked you before we had other people join. I've got no idea how to Zsiboracs?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, okay. Should have just said it and would have been right, but there you are. That was a wild guess. Well, welcome both. I think it's going to be really interesting to cover, certainly a topical, and this is in the context of the DNS. We're not talking. Otherwise, that's a very big topic to talk about AI privacy and confidentiality for everything. So look forward to that, and then we'll see what time we have left for other things once we've done that. So without further ado, let me stop sharing, which I've done, and hand over to Mark and Dorottya, and sort of really looking forward to the discussion. So over to you both.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be back with you again this week. As Andrew's mentioned, we intended to cover this as the second part of last week's presentation, but things overran. I will also apologise, based on Andrew's comments just now, that it is quite a general presentation about privacy and confidentiality we're going to undertake today. So it may well be quite a wide-reaching in its as well as not just focused on DNS, but hopefully it will be interesting. And of course, all these topics intersect heavily with the work that we all do in this sector as well. So briefly, for those who weren't here on the call last week, I'm Mark Robertshaw. I'm the CTO of the DNS Research Federation. We're a not-for-profit entity in the UK, and with a mission to advance the understanding of the DNS in general, but also particularly focuses, I guess, on internet abuse increasingly is a big focus for us, but also generally looking at the data and trends in a DNS sector and market as well. So that's kind of what we do. I'll just briefly hand over to Dorottya to introduce herself as well, because she's going to be co-presenting with me today.
Thank you, Mark. I'm also Dorottya Zsiboracs, and I'm working for Oxial as a policy and research analyst. And yeah, I'm also doing my master's in Oxford at the same time, and looking at different applications of DNS, AI, privacy issues in general as well in my studies. And obviously a lot of research with Emily Taylor, who is leading the policy team at DNSRF and Oxial.
Great, thank you. So I shall hopefully share my screen now, and we will proceed to go ahead. So the topic we're talking about today is, as we've mentioned, AI with a particular interest in privacy and confidentiality, and I guess the impacts and challenges of AI being introduced, particularly into operational workflows that we might have. And the idea today is for it not just to be a kind of we're going to give you a nice presentation, nice talk, but actually to very much hear from all of you about your experience and your thoughts. So we're going to sort of start with a bit of a sort of presentation, but then jump into more sort of question and answer session with some guided thoughts about things that we might want to discuss at the end. But we're very happy for this to go whichever way it goes. So feel free as we talk, and when we sort of wrap up to take that in whichever direction you like. So I guess just by way of introduction, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of stuff, but the last sort of really 5 years, we've seen a real explosion in the use of AI and machine learning. And this is particularly use of these large language models, which we're seeing increasingly being used to do all sorts of things. But the obvious ones that we see day to day these days are the advanced tools that many of us might use for fun, or for actually getting some work done sometimes, such as ChatGPT and the other prompts that go alongside that. Very popular. Many of you will no doubt notice, as I have, that we're now being pushed AI summaries all the time in it. Whenever we do a Google search, that's now the de facto. Many of my colleagues have been complaining to me the last couple of weeks that you can't turn them off very easily. So if anybody's got any sort of experience in disabling those, we'd be interested to hear from you. But that's something that's definitely happening now, and we're starting to see lots of AI in the in our sort of day-to-day just browsing life as well. Obviously, we've had targeted advertising for quite some time, using user behavior to populate large learning models to then push recommendations and that kind of stuff. And of course, the other one that we often hit day to day is all the chat bots, which I guess similar to ChatGPT, but much more focused on solving particular business problems. So I mean, I'm sure very familiar to everybody, but this kind, just to sort of set the scene, that we're in our daily lives now, we're being surrounded really by AI in these different ways. And I mean, the other thing that's becoming quite interesting, I think interfaces a lot with the DNS sector, is this idea of deep fakes. And I'll hand over to Dorottya to talk a little bit about deep fakes for a minute.
Yes, Mark might be able to provide an interesting example that he had a conversation with at one of the conferences. But just in terms of privacy and confidentiality issues, obviously deepfakes do raise a lot of issues when it comes to invasion of privacy, such as the creation of content without the consent of the individual, the exploitation of public figures and potentially business leaders. But then it also comes to cyberbullying. Deepfakes do play an important or do pose an important threat to businesses and business leaders. Obviously, there is a problem with potential impersonation of private communications when it comes to businesses, and then the potential of phishing and fraud, which does happen, and it is increasingly happens in the cyberspace, which is obviously relevant to the DNS sector as well. And then when it comes to elections, to look at sort of the more geopolitical perspective, as we live sort of 2024 was called the year of elections, there are more and more deepfakes circling around on the internet and social media, which does cause a problem when it comes to trust issues in the DNS sector as well. And then obviously this has a legal and ethical concerns as well, as there is a lack of regulation when it comes to deepfakes, because these are still developing frameworks and many jurisdictions don't really have a comprehensive law on their misuse, and it makes it really difficult for the victims to seek justice. So we can talk about it later and how everyone is experiencing that, but it is obviously an issue that is faced by many of us working in the cybersecurity sector, and it is something that is increasingly advanced and more of a concern as it's being more and more developed, and the regulations are not keeping up with the pace of technological development in this area. Brilliant.
So moving on to sort of, moving forward from the kind of general use casing into kind of like, maybe the corporate environments that many of us may work in or intersect with. So we come from a background of, explicit policies where we're used to rules, network restrictions, training, monitoring compliance, this kind of thing, very sort of, straightforward rules. And we're moving increasingly into a sort of environment where AI is starting to be used a lot more in these environments. So, and this raised a couple of just interesting questions. So, and how much should AI systems be allowed to make automated decisions within the commercial context? And that the following question: where is that line between information and decision making? We have a lot of the benefit of the AI tools that we see on the market is that they can increase our information exposure. And we'll touch on later on the fact that, at the moment, the latest versions of ChatGPT, for example, also perform internet searches as part of their analysis. So you're ending up with now an intersection of AI with kind of up-to-date real-time data, and that intersection is, on one sense, very positive. But where is that line between actual, between information and actually allowing the AI to make decisions on our behalf? And the thing that's of interest to me, actually individually, particularly, is how is the use of AI tools affecting our behavior and interactions? And does this spill over into human interactions? So I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody else at, shouting at Alexa, for example, at home, demanding, of things, or going to ChatGPT and asking a series of very demanding questions. Is this behavior that we're getting used to in dealing with these artificial intelligence systems ultimately going to impact the way that we behave, both in a kind of corporate environment at work, with our colleagues, at home with our families? Is there a risk of the use of AI as a seemingly friendly companion going to seep into the way that we deal with people in the real world? So there's just a couple of sort of starter questions about your behavior really in the environment. Moving on to the topic of interest for today, privacy concerns. So I've split this into two broad sections. We've got what we call direct interactions within the workplace. So you've got examples would be employees discussing company confidential topics with third-party LLMs, and I'm sure that this goes on in many environments now because you might want to just ask it to reword something for you, or it might just ask it a question. And actually, are we ultimately discussing topics that we perhaps shouldn't be doing with these LLMs? Another one that's kind of slightly more subtle and very relevant probably to this group of people here, and certainly relevant to me in my day job, is uploading code for bug fixes to an LLM for inputs. And on the one hand, these systems are extremely good at coding. It's been my experience that you give it a bit of code, it will refactor, it'll turn into a nice bit of code. But I guess that there are some definite concerns about that. Are you inadvertently sharing your IP with an LLM that may well be using that input for subsequent training of its models? By sharing a bug, are you infecting other people's use of that LLM by misclassification of some code that you said as being correct codes? Due to the way that LLMs work, there's a line between whether the trust of these systems, but also whether in fact you are inadvertently giving away your IP or other private or confidential data that you have around. And I guess the other thing that's an interesting one is, employees engaging in conversations at work about their private lives, and when the potential impact that might have, and sort of ultimate blowback that might have on those individuals if they're using company resources to feed and seed a public LLM for future training models. So those are sort of what I call direct interactions. And maybe, Dorothea, do you want to add anything more to that one?
Not at this point. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So on to the next one is the more what we call the indirect interactions, and this is one that's I think a little bit more subtle. And again, at the level that we work at often as technical people, many of us are using AI now increasingly to perform matching and scoring. It's a very good example if you're looking at sort of content matching at scale, which we often do as part of the research that we perform at DNSRF. Then you want to utilize these tools because they provide very, very good out-of-the-box matching tools. And it's one of those things where you send, but are we inadvertently sending data to these platforms and effectively, breaching some of our own privacy guidelines, that we wouldn't dream of sending this data out to other people in such a sort of ad hoc manner, but are we, by using these APIs for programmatic purposes, inadvertently exposing ourselves in that way? And I guess the other, and I've mentioned already about the integration of real-time web searching, that actually this is can have an amplification effect. I mean, you know, one would think that if you publish things on the web, you're probably happy for that information to be circulated. But is there something about the amplification process here that could be a concern, I guess, in terms of the power these platforms have now in mixing and matching? So that kind of, I guess, gives us a sense of the sort of privacy concerns we might have as technical people, sort of in the workplace, but also kind of, I guess, looking at the whole picture. And I guess the other side is called confidentiality. And I mean, there's a slight subtlety between the differences of these two terms. And I must admit to sometimes being a bit blurry myself about the difference. But I guess what we're talking about here is confidential information, which might well be, you know, company private information, or indeed personal company records such as employee data and that kind of thing. And, you know, the concerns about confidentiality leaks being a real thing with LLMs. So I think, Dorothy, you want to talk a bit about this one, perhaps, in terms of the risks here.
Yes. So, for example, in a business concern, I'm mostly studying the military intelligence sort of applications of using LLMs in intelligence gathering and also intelligence sharing. But the same rule applies to in the business environment as well. So when it comes to, first of all, the first problem could arise from data collection and how private information and confidential information is being collected. Applying LLMs to private systems and internal systems, there could be an issue when it comes to sort of gathering data and putting out results and outcomes based on sensitive information, which maybe the source of the information cannot be tracked back as easily, or the people who are making the recommendations and making the decisions might not have access to the source of data based on, or the people who are dealing with the outcomes might not have access to the source of data that they are making decisions of. The other problem with sort of using LLMs when it comes to intelligence sharing or information sharing with a company is that even though LLMs are used very well for data collection, there might be issues when it comes to sharing information on different levels of confidentiality. So it might be an issue that LLMs and using AI, there might be an sort of automatic oversharing of sensitive information with employees who shouldn't have access to the information provided. And the system is not just ready to sort of process the different levels of confidentiality. That has been a problem in sort of military intelligence when it comes to, for example, situations in Ukraine, but then in other military and intelligence applications as well, that the systems are ready to collect data, but when it comes to sharing of information, it might not be ready to know the exact levels of confidence for sharing. And this might be very much applicable when using these LLMs to one's business and sort of sharing different levels of information with either partners or third parties that the company is working with.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really important, is that, you know, from a technical standpoint as well, I mean, it's very hard to encode all the rules of an internal well-developed system into an LLM in an effective way. So if you're going to just fire an LLM at will at your sort of heavily granular permissions CRM, for example, or other internal system, and then I think, you know, actually ensuring and enforcing all the rules that would be applicable in that system whilst maintaining confidentiality is a very challenging problem in itself. I mean, the other aspect, I think, to that is the existing systems we already use and trust implicitly, and whether they themselves would be subject to you know, confidentiality leaks. So a good example I would cite here would be, for example, Google Drive. We all use, many of us will use Google Drive and trust it implicitly, and you know, it has its, you know, granular permission system, you know, absolutely fine, it's safe. But as we move towards the use of AI for suggestions, for finding content, for filtering content, I think the risks of those bits of software actually you know, actually maintaining those rules as tightly as they do perhaps within the existing navigation system, via a sort of cross-cutting LLM-based searching system. I think that there's risk factors there as well. So I think we need to be very careful about use of LLMs when superimposed on our precious data within our organizations, and particularly when it comes to use of the outputs, those LLMs, by lots of different types of employee within the organization. So that's kind of summed up sort of, I guess, the concerns we might have as you know, as professionals working in certainly in the sector we're working in as you know, DNS and sort of technology people, and actually how the sort of privacy and confidentiality aspects would interface with use of LLMs. And it sounds like we're painting quite a negative picture, and hopefully you know, I think to address that a bit, you know, I think there is hope. You know, I don't think we're stuck in a sort of, you know, this is all a disaster, and this is all you know, all negative and all problematic. And I think part of that is that there is legislation both on its way and some that's already being enacted as we speak to try and provide some sort of regulation of the AI environment. And the first one of those, for those of us based in the EU, there is the EU AI Act, which actually classifies AI systems in three sort of broad categories. So the first category being what we deem to be unacceptable risk systems, and these are systems that would not be permitted under the Act. And those are things such as, you know, you might expect behavioral manipulation systems, social scoring, biometric identification, things like that, things that would be, you know, considered to be not acceptable. Then we have the category of what we call high risk systems, which would also under the Act require registration actually with the jurisdiction where they're operating, and they would include things like management and operation of critical infrastructure. So that would incorporate the things that you know, Dorottya has discussed, the sort of military stuff as well, but also things like education training, you know, where you're sort of putting a demonstrable impact on, you know, people's learning and best practices, and also of course law enforcement. Those would be also considered to be high risk systems, and they would be regulated with a requirement to register them with the entity. And the final type, of course, is the lower risk solutions, which are the ones that we're more familiar with in our day-to-day life. ChatGPT, that would be acceptable, but with some caveats. And the most important caveat here is a caveat of transparency. So it's saying that actually, if you're going to put forward a system that is using AI, you should make that very clear. You should disclose that content was created with AI. You should prevent, obviously, illegal content from being on the platform. You should also be very clear about whether your training data for your system has used copyright material as well. So there's protection there for not only for, you know, protecting, you know, people from illegal content, but also from content that would be, you know, would breach IP as well. So I think that's positive in terms of the you know, where things are going in the EU space. I'll hand over to Dorottya to talk more about the US space. I know there's a number on the call from the US as well.
So just maybe if you could go back to the previous slide, just one sentence about, I thought it might be interesting for the DNS sector, how might the EU AI Act apply to the DNS sector as well, even though the DNS sector may not be directly targeted by the regulation, but because DNS operators and providers and services do handle sensitive data that are used for security, optimization, or user data management, there might be things that do affect the sector. As Mark explained, the EU AI Act applies a risk-based approach. So there is this unacceptable, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk categories. But when it comes to DNS providers, they might often use AI for threat detection, for example, and mitigation. So such systems do identify, for example, domain name abuses. So if it comes to, let's say, systems that are classified high risk, providers may need to comply with strict transparency oversight and data governance requirements that are set by EU AI Act. So that might be interesting for participants in this call. And also when it comes to protection of personal data, AI systems are being used for DNS management. And when it comes to personal data, for example, whois databases or DNS queries, they will need to comply with the EU AI Act and GDPR, which obviously includes as well limiting bias and ensuring data quality and avoiding discriminatory or open decision making. So going further to the US landscape, there have been various steps in terms of regulating AI and LLM model development on the federal level. Obviously, all the states have their own approach, which might be more direct than a federal approach. But in terms of what has been decided on a federal level, on September 8, 2023, there was this bipartisan framework for the US AI Act, which basically proposed the creation of an independent oversight body that would deal with the licensing of the companies that develop general purpose AI models. This is sort of to standardize and centralize the sort of operations of these companies who work on developing these models to create trust and safety in this whole field. The second one, which was obviously a more common and more known one, is the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development of use of AI, which is a sort of really broad, comprehensive approach to AI standards and safety, which obviously does have applications to the DNS system as well, and obviously addresses various cybersecurity issues which we might encounter. The only thing that I wanted to highlight with this executive order is that an executive order can be revoked by the next administration. So even though this is a comprehensive approach, which is really basing the ground and really leading the way in terms of how AI standards and safety could apply, even on an international level, this might be very well revoked by the next administration, given it changes. And the last one, which I would highlight, is the NIST's Generative AI Public Working Group, which is still an existing working group that works on developing a cross-sectoral AI risk management framework, have many participants from the private and public sector as well, which could be also something that in the UK or EU we might follow, that sort of private-public cooperation in sort of setting a risk management framework. And then other than these federal level applications, there are many voluntary commitments, both from the private and public sector, in sort of how to cooperate in developing standards and sort of commitments to AI safety.
Brilliant. So we feel that we've probably spoken enough now, and we've given you hopefully lots of sort of food for firing certainly comments and questions if you like. I see that we've already had some discussion on the chat already, which is great. But before we do that, we thought we'd just give a couple of a few thoughts. I'll hand back to Dorottya to give these points that in terms of the some things to think about, and perhaps stimulate some more conversation as we sort of go to the second phase of the meeting. Andrew, do you want to say something at this point?
I'll come in after you finished, Mark. So carry on. Sorry.
Oh well. You want to go ahead with this, Dorottya?
Sure. So we talked about sort of AI regulation, privacy, and confidentiality issues, and we sort of approached it from the state sort of led regulation. But when it comes to AI, obviously these models are being developed by the private sector, so this is a much more complex regulatory landscape. So I sort of put this question here, which sort of reflects on the role of the private sector, that given the concentration of AI development resources among a few well-resourced companies like OpenAI and the others, and the smaller enterprises' dependencies on these models, how can regulatory frameworks like the EU AI Act ensure that privacy and confidentiality are safeguarded without disproportionately burdening smaller providers? And what are the specific obligations that should be placed on large AI developers to promote a fairer and more secure ecosystem for all stakeholders? So this is sort of the consideration of big players and small players in the private sector. And then also I put a question about how do we make sure that privacy protections keep up with technological advancements? This is especially being the extraterritorial effects of EU AI Act and other regulations, which might apply to countries where the privacy regulations are either inexistent or are not so developed, and AI models are already being used. So sort of this question of technological advancement versus privacy protection. And the last question that I proposed here, which we want to think about collectively, is that when it comes to AI making decisions based on personal data, such as in hiring or healthcare, how can we ensure transparency and fairness while preserving confidentiality? This is sort of reflecting on the latter considerations of confidentiality. But these are just some leading questions, but from here we can go, I think, anywhere, and especially when it comes to the DNS sector, questions about sort of who are the stakeholders and how they might approach these questions when it comes to LLM and AI models that are being developed by other bigger sort of private sector companies.
Brilliant. Cool. So we're very happy to now open up the conversation. So if people have got thoughts, comments, or want to ask questions, then please go. I think Andrew had your hand up first, didn't you? I think there.
So, that's really interesting. So, thank you for the presentation, which covered a lot of ground in a sort of very concisely. So that was fantastic. A couple of comments from the RSA conference earlier this year, which I thought might be useful to share. One was the view then, 4 months ago, was although AI can be used by both attackers and defenders in the cyberspace, the view then was that it was overall, they thought it was a net positive for defenders currently rather than attackers, which was interesting to hear. But one of the things they picked out, which is a really mundane piece, which I think was sort of what you were hinting at the start of the presentation, was people have to sort of do basics like look at their employee policies and maybe have something which says you can't use public models to ask questions about commercially sensitive or confidential information. Because, for example, think about GDPR. If I went to ChatGPT, I could ask it, "What do you know about the DNS Research Federation?" And I'm sure Mark, Dorottya, and others would be very concerned if it threw up a whole load of confidential information based on prompts that have been fed in by your colleagues. So there's some fairly easy things to think about in terms of vulnerabilities with the public models, that is, and how well protected your information might be if you use those. And then perhaps the thing I was going to finish on, just to sort of, since you mentioned about the use of LLMs for code, so I thought it was worth asking you a question about this, Mark. How do you handle any concerns about so-called hallucinations when it comes to code? Because if it's generated a few tens of thousands of lines of code for me, spotting those hallucinations might be problematic. But if you've been using that in anger, you may have a view on that. So I'll be interested in that. And then we'll pick up other questions in the chat, and also other people have raised their hands.
I would actually love to open that question to the wider group to answer as well. I mean, individually in our organisation, we've been quite conservative with our use of code tools for generator tools using AI. We have the IDEs that we use does have a built-in AI code generator, which one of my colleagues tried and decided was actually not that great. So I think there's quality concerns. I think ChatGPT is particularly good you know, giving you code snippets, and I have used that not commercially, but just for trying it out. But I think you're right there. You know, we have to be very careful about quality control here. You know, it's a bit like we're talking about with generally about decision making. People sort of trusting these tools so much that they're stopping thinking for themselves. And my general approach is to be cautious and not to abandon best practices. In our case, that would be things such as, you know, test-driven developments, where the tests are always written by the human, not by the machine. So you know, sure, use generation for the code, but make sure that you write the tests yourself, for example, that kind of thing. But I'd love to hear answers from that from the floor. So anybody else had any experience of using code generation and quality control?
If you do, sort of raise your virtual hand or pop something in the chat. And if everyone's got used it in anger, it'd be really interesting. In the meantime, there's 3 comments in the chat, and then Glenn's got his hand raised. So Robert has asked, how do you see the AI tools tune or affect social media algorithms? Are they being used to enhance mis or disinformation filtering? Which, as he rightly observes, can potentially spill over into other arenas, because people have perhaps got the wrong information they're basing their positions on. So any thoughts on use of AI tools on social media algorithms, Mark or Dorottya? And if you haven't, that's fine, if that's outside of what you've considered thus far.
You want to take that, Dorottya?
Sure. I can have a go with it. Obviously, it's a broad topic, so it would be hard to cover, but I have some thoughts to share. So obviously, when it comes to social media and sort of the use of AI and algorithms, social media companies do use it for sort of content personalization and sort of user engagement optimization, which is a positive, I guess, from a business sort of perspective. But when it comes to polarization in the society, this is obviously an issue, as we see it for elections. If someone is reading the same type of content and clicking on the same type of content, algorithms are being sort of used to provide further contents from the same sort of perspective. So when it comes to societal polarization, this is just something that even further increases sort of views on one side, and then makes one person less exposed to the other side. So this is obviously something that is very much in place when it comes to social media, and very much of a problem when it comes to elections. And someone is only, let's say, is a Republican and only listening to and have friends on social media who are sharing their views. The ads that are coming up on one's social media feed will be targeted for that sort of audience, political ads and also public discourse. Which is obviously could be misleading and manipulative ads sometimes, because it's really hard to sort of control as well from social media companies what exactly is going on the website. And then misinformation is not, and disinformation is not something that is so obvious all the time. So that's exactly the point of disinformation, that it does mix truth with sort of false content. So this is really hard to control it, and especially in the United States, where freedom of speech and freedom of expression is so upheld by all these companies, this sort of Silicon Valley mentality, which is obviously very important. But when it comes to misinformation and disinformation and sort of taking down the content, this is always a very problematic issue of how do you categorize something as disinformation, and how do you make sure that you try to mitigate this sort of echo chambers and filter bubbles that do get created by algorithms, and the amplification of extremes that are happening in social media.
Yeah, thanks, Dorothy. And I guess probably doesn't need AI to create some of those problems. It maybe just amplifies the sort of bad behavior of humans anyway, but just makes it even harder. I think Kurt's comments also just make the general point about being hard to distinguish between real people and artificial content. And I know you sort of Mark, from your presentation, you highlighted in Europe there's maybe a requirement to signpost that, but probably not. That's not the case in other jurisdictions, which makes it harder. I think Glenn and Peter both are patiently waiting with your hands raised. So, Glenn, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Interesting points raised here. A couple of things. Right now, we're in this golden age where we have a lot of companies who are trying to prove the value of their AI LLMs and their services they can offer. I think we're a little bit in the age of we're getting it for free. Certainly, this is a computationally expensive task. I'm wondering your thoughts on the economic model around it, and also, are we going to see emergence of things where, like, you pay one price, you get the free answer, which is not so good, especially if we're talking about code. The free answer is a code that's not very optimized, maybe a little better money you pay to the party, you get a slightly more optimized code, and then there's the premium version. And any thoughts on where the economics stuff will eventually go? And by the way, I'll throw a question too. If somebody pays for the premium code version, and then they give it to their buddy Andrew, who then puts it off in his product, is that infringement? Have I stolen from the AI? Because the AIs can't claim rights to what they created. Therefore, is it really infringement if I give the thing I paid for to Andrew, and Andrew takes off and puts it in his product?
Yeah, that's really good questions. I think Pete's actually just very nicely in the chat given a good answer to that. There already is indeed paid for and free versions, and OpenAI are a really good example of that. So obviously ChatGPT is there. They're sort of the carrot they're dangling to say come and join us in the world of AI. But you do have capped numbers of requests without paying, and you get timed out for a while, and they have all that down to a T. You are right. It's surprising how much they can offer for free, given the computational power to require for this. On a slightly tangential point, sorry to diverge from this slightly. The other side of it is that a number of people are now jumping on the eco bandwagon with this as well, because actually, I've seen this last couple of weeks on some friends of mine on LinkedIn posting about boycotting Google because of their use of AI in the search results, because of the computational expense, and suggesting alternative browsers to actually reduce their eco footprint. So I think there's a number of intersections around the economics and also the sheer, as you say, sheer computational power. So that's just a sort of brief one. Pete might want to add more to that in terms of the commercial models, if you go to Pete next for his question as well.
Okay, segue neatly into Pete then.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. Sorry, Robert, Mark. What did you want me to expand on exactly? I was just reading about. I was reading on the side about the EU AI Act, which sounds a bit like old McDonald song. But what was it?
I know it's just that you responded to Glenn on the point about the premium and the costs.
Oh, yeah. So with OpenAI, I don't know if you played around with ChatGPT, but the ChatGPT 3.5 is free, and the ChatGPT 4 and 4.0 and the other ones are, I think, limited. You get, I'm not sure. I actually pay for it, so I get access to. I don't know what the limitations are on the free version. But it's definitely a kind of like, it's much better. 4 is like leagues better. But like you say, if using it for code generation, then it's definitely going to be something that you want to check. But I think Mark's point, your point about using standard practices like TDD, having a unit test and etc., are going to mitigate any issues that you might come up with code generation quite a lot. It's kind of a shortcut. It's a tool. It's like the a calculator versus, you still need the skills to be able to check it. And if the skills encompass checking a 10,000 line generated code base, that's just what you're going to need to have to be able to do, unfortunately. But in the same way that you would have a junior programmer create a code base for you, you're still going to need someone to check over it, to test it, to make sure that it's working properly, or at least deal with the bugs afterwards. I had a couple of questions. So the reason I was reading about the EU AI Act, I really want to do that in the old McDonald thing. I was curious whether it, what's the kind of who it affects, and apparently the I was specifically with the UK, like because the UK isn't in the EU anymore, does it affect us at all? And apparently it affects any company, any of the 27 member states, but also anybody doing business with customers in the EU. So it's pretty wide ranging, which means I was curious, like also with the US stuff, will that affect anybody doing business with them, or is it just in that jurisdiction? Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to enforce, but yeah, that's going to be interesting to see how that plans, how that works out. So one thing I was curious about, so you talk about indirect exposure to AI. In terms of like DNS, I could imagine that my DNS queries that I'm sending to my ISP are being fed into some LLM somewhere. And I haven't given explicit permission for that. But does it matter if the use is private? Like there's two sides to it. It's like what the data that you're providing and the use that you're getting out of it. And I guess I'm going to have to look at this EUA Act a bit more carefully, I think. But like, does it matter if it's just a purely internal use? If I haven't given permission, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions because, of course, there's so much analysis that goes on behind the scenes. You know, setting aside AI in the strictest sense, there's so much, you know, metadata gathering, analysis, and you know, behind and also user behavior tracking that's been going on for donkey's years. And it's the interesting question is whether, because we're now calling things AI, whether we are, you know, overly, you know, honing in on this thing as a problem, or whether in fact we're just becoming more aware of things that have been actually going on for many years. And I think it's a really interesting question. But I'm sure you're right. You know, I know you're right because I know that the providers that we work with for data provision use AI for their analysis, and that includes people who are running public resolvers. So, you know, you're quite right.
I was going to say that the whole discussion reminded me a lot about tracking and privacy in general on the internet. It's my personal bugbear. You know, it's something that I'm kind of personally involved in, and I didn't want to bang on about it too much. But it is basically the same kind of discussions. This data that's being tracked about us. We've ended up with all sorts of different solutions, like the GDPR and cookie consent forms, and you know, different laws that are in place in different parts of the world, and like 15 different ones in the US for different states. But this is like 10, 15 years after the issue was identified. So I'm curious. I think regulation is really the only way that this is going to be solved or partially solved. But I think it's going to take a long time before there's anything kind of approaching usefulness. Like Glenn said, we're kind of getting it for free at the moment, or at least the company like OpenAI and companies are getting it for free. They're also going to get sued a lot. There's quite a lot of lawsuits about them using copyrighted information and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's all a big mess, isn't it, really?
So you might see some cases where people realize that the prompts they're feeding in are actually being consumed by the models as new data.
Yeah.
So that's the case. That might lead to some further issues in terms of privacy.
On that point, sorry, Andrew, just to say on that point, we've confirmed that the majority of the providers do caveat that they will use prompt data for training. So it's not a kind of if, it's they absolutely do actively use it for training future models. So I'm sure that's partly why we're going to start seeing more and more lawsuits over time.
Sorry, just one other point that I was thinking about when you were doing your presentation was the other side of it is user awareness. Again, this is the same thing with tracking and privacy online. Is when people are aware that their information is being used in that way, then they become more careful about how things, what they do. But at the moment, I think there is a lot of, in our circles, maybe people are a bit more aware, but like a lot of people just don't realize that what they're doing is being fed into some big model somewhere. And that's another thing which is going to have to be sort of tackled at some point somehow, and it'll come through on like, you know, BBC articles and stuff like that. But yeah, again, it'll take a long time before it actually hits the public consciousness properly. Anyway. Thanks.
No, Kathleen, I'm conscious of the time. You had your hand raised, then lowered it. Did you want to come in with anything before we wrap this up?
Sure, I put it in the chat. It was just keying off of something Glenn had said on the economic models to share that Google, they presented this probably multiple places, but I saw it at UK Cyber, where Heather Atkins talked about the economic modeling and improvements that they were able to do. And she had very specific numbers and percentages for improvements around their security program driven by AI increases. And, you know, in terms of productivity and other measures, not just numbers from a pure your standpoint of resources, both compute and human. So I thought that might be of interest, just to know that some organizations who have integrated into products are doing that.
Great. Good point. Thank you. There's a couple of points in the chat which I'll just read out loud because I think they're worth highlighting. I think Eric, towards the bottom of the chat, has made the point about using private machine learning systems for analysing, well, in the comments specifically, DNS data for cybersecurity uses, but broadening that to other data that you wish to keep private. There are ways of doing that without dropping into the public models. So I think that's a good thought. The other good thought, just to close on, is from Glenn. Either way, lawyers are going to be making a fortune until they're replaced by the AI models that are currently learning how they work, to paraphrase the comment from Kurt and others. So the law firms, to generalize the point, will be making a fortune regardless, but that's generally true. Yes, that's life. Okay, conscious of the time, thank you. I think you triggered the start of a really interesting conversation, Mark and Dorottya, so thank you for that. I hope other people have found that useful, and will look out some more for or think some more about the topic and the many burgeoning laws and things in this area. But yeah, I think this is something which people are going to look back on in a few years' time and wonder aghast why people ever did that in that way, much like with the analogy with cookies and other things. But hey ho. Thank you. Right, just briefly, I will just reshare my screen, but not to cover very much, just mindful of the time. So those of you with the sort of news headlines will have seen this stuff, so I won't dwell on it. Just highlight two things. Since we often refer to the excellent material from the APNIC labs, João helpfully recorded a piece on their podcast just as a memoir on how the system works. So if you've wondered about that and maybe missed João or indeed others from the team explaining, so Jeff in particular, how it works, then the link's there to find out about that. Also, there's some further information on the sort of DNS redirection in Malaysia, just building on some coverage from beginning of August, just on if you use public resolvers which bypass the sort of DNS filtering, then you'll be redirected from Google or Cloudflare onto local resolvers to give you the answer or not to your query in Malaysia. And also, since I mentioned it in passing, the ICANN DNS Symposium agenda, specifically for the DNS Symposium Day, has just been published, so that's available if that's of interest to you. A couple of the more general points, you see that Elise Feur has announced she's departing from Etno. I think she's, if I remember from the article, been there about 8 years roughly. So presumably her replacement will be announced in due course, but she's stepping down. And there was an interesting piece also from the DNS Research Federation, so from I think some of Mark and Dorottya's colleagues on this revision 4 of the Global Digital Compact. Those of you with an interest on the sort of policy side. Some deadlines this week. Sorry, me to reverse that. So just quickly to signpost those. If you wanted to feedback on some of the proposals for the EU Digital Identity Wallet, you've got till the end of today for that. If you want to apply for support to participate in the IGF 24 event in December, you've got till tomorrow for that. And then if you want to potentially get a free ticket to attend the RIPE 89 meeting in Prague, you've got till the 13th to submit your article for consideration to win a prize for that. And there's some other things coming up later on this month and onwards, which again, we don't have time to. The sort of next main event coming up is the ICANN DNS Symposium Week, which you can see, which is at the end of this month, and then plenty of stuff from then on, which I won't read out, but including the sort of the OAuth 43 meeting, followed by the RIPE 89 meeting, followed immediately by ITF 121. So, and then a whole load of other things you can see on the screen as well. Finally, I just sort of dropped Michael an email, just having a look at maybe just changing the date for the NIS2 presentation. We've finalised that. I'll ping out an email in the next sort of 24 hours, hopefully, to confirm. I know Michael is put in the chat is flexible, so we just finalise a new time and confirm that. So it probably won't be next Monday. That's principally because again, another mention of the ICANN, the DNS Research Federation have scheduled a round table on Monday, which sort of starts and exactly overlaps with the call. So I'm trying to accommodate that because it will be of interest to some people. So yeah, I'll confirm that when I put out the link to the recording for this call. But thank you, Michael, in advance for your flexibility, which is much appreciated. So that's it from me. So let me stop sharing. We're just over the hour. Just briefly pause to see if anyone had anything you wanted to briefly jump in with. If so, put it in the chat or just unmute.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you for arranging the call, and thank you to the presenters. There was a comment from Kathleen before on the Google presenting something on the UK Saba. I tried in chat, but it didn't work. I was wondering if Kathleen can very quickly summarize what happened and what was it about.
Okay, Kathleen, I think you're still on. Could you just repeat the point about the UK Cyber?
Sure. So it was Heather Atkins' presentation. You might want to look up to see if she has anything published because it's really her work. I was just in the audience. And she cited some statistics, which I do not remember offhand, except that they were big gains in efficiency and what her team running security for Google was able to accomplish with AI. And so they had done economic modeling that considered both the resources of the AI plus the individuals and what was accomplished with that addition. And it was huge gains.
I'll look up for that sort of post call, and if I can find a link to the presentation, I'll include that.
I see. Thank you very much. I was curious about it. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you to Peter as well.
Brilliant. Okay, well, on that point then, thank you everyone. Thank you again, Mark and Dorothy. Much appreciate your joint presentation. I hope that was useful to everyone. Have a fantastic week, and as I signposted, we won't be discussing NIS2 next week. So, but look out for the link to the recording with confirmation of the revised timing. But have a great week in the meantime. Thanks all.